You recognize, do you not, that we are here today for a specific purpose and purposes? You notice on the stand we have with us today Judge Wallace Lee, District Judge, who is the first counselor in our family presidency. Renee Durfee could not be here. She's the second counselor. You see on the stand also President Douglas D. Alder, previous counselor in the Temple presidency and also previous president of the Dixie College. We also have on the stand Vern Lee. Anyone who hasn't known much about Vern Lee has missed a great deal. It would be a wise thing if we could take just a moment and do something that we've said that we do in this reunion, and that is remember and enter a period of reconciliation. So in the spirit of reconciliation, can we ask those of you over there to come and sit here, and those over there to come and sit here, and we will be well reconciled. There is a front row that would work very well or anywhere else. I know that this is a little bit of an imposition, but for hearing, it works very well. The music that you have heard this morning already is to add to the fact that we come for a purpose. And Isla Mae Richardson played at the organ and will continue. And we'll sing a hymn, How Great Thou Art. It's kind of a long hymn. Hope it doesn't tire you.
We want us to sing 2 choruses,
Okay.
and 4th verses.
Okay, now I didn't hear that, so you can repeat that.
We only want to sing 2 choruses, once after the 2nd verse and once after the 4th verse.
All right, if you can remember that, you're doing very well. After which it is appropriate that we recognize that every time we meet together, especially in a building that is dedicated under the authority of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we mean to recognize Him who has created it all and His Son Jesus Christ. And for that reason, we'll call upon Rick Williamson to do that. We'll sing How Great Thou Art, number 86, and we'll sing the chorus after this 2nd and 4th verses, if I got that right. Number 86.
Consider all the Our dear, kind Heavenly Father, we are so thankful as we meet here this morning in this wonderful chapel. We're thankful for the many blessings that Thou hast bestowed upon us, that we are members and relatives and friends of our beloved John D. Lee, and we are met this morning to honor him and the wonderful life that he led and the wonderful things he accomplished, that he pioneered the way for all of us to enjoy the good things of life that we now do. In the church, in our personal lives, in the ward buildings that we meet in the temple that we have here in St. George, and the many of the 130 temples that we have throughout the world. For these things we are so thankful. We also, Heavenly Father, are thankful for our grandmothers, our great-great-grandmothers that were the wives of John D. Lee. They were noble, wonderful pioneer women that sacrificed so much and worked so hard on our behalf that we could enjoy their good life and the blessings that we now do. And Heavenly Father, also we are met here to honor our Savior Jesus Christ, his life, his sacrifice that he made on our behalf, that he spared nothing to give us the life and the atonement and the eternal life that is awaiting for us, and life after death. For all these things we are so thankful. We're thankful for his teachings and for his gospel and for the blessings that he has given us and shown us and led the way for us to follow him, and his wonderful life that he portrayed for us here upon the earth. We're thankful for all these things, Heavenly Father. We pray that thy Spirit will now be with us in this meeting. Bless those that will speak to us and teach us, that they will have thy guiding direction with them. And for these things we pray humbly in the name of our beloved Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Those of us who realized before today that we were going to be blessed to have the ex-president of Dixie College and the previous counselor in the presidency of the temple to be here to speak to us, know how much we have anticipated that. Douglas D. Alder is in the process of developing a history of the St. George area, and we'd hope to be able to read that in the future. Today we're going to ask him to speak to us. The fact that he is of a family that does not include members of the Lee family is no problem for us. The good that can come from those who are in the community and looked upon those of the Lee family as supporters of a good community and people of integrity are parts of reconciliation. In that view, then, we ask Douglas D. Alder to speak to us.
So that you'll feel comfortable, I'm going to take off the microphone. I have worried and worried and worried about facing you. Why do we discuss this 152 years later? You well know, if any of you lived in Dixie, that the majority view here was, let it rest. Let's just not pursue it again. Juanita Brooks heard that many times. But we don't let the Civil War rest, or the American Revolution, or any other major things that happened. Things happened, and they continue to have impact on us. Now, Now, what's my role here today? I'm merely an informed reader. I'm not a researcher on the Mountain Meadows Massacre. My field's actually German history, but I've taught a lot of Utah and American history. So I'm just here as an informed reader. Many of you probably know more about this subject than I do. Now, as a history teacher, let me ask you, how are we supposed to read history? Now, here's my view. When you come into a history class or when you pick up a history book, you may not be aware you have a mindset. You bring with you a mindset when you start reading this or listening to somebody. As a historian, I say, please take that mindset and set it over here on this table. If your mindset is pro John D. Lee, put it over there. If it's anti John D. Lee, put it over there. If it's whatever. And try to look at it as though you weren't in the present, but that you were back at the time. We tend to look at things with a mindset I call a paradigm. Some people look things from a point of dogma. Of course, because I'm a German historian, I've dealt a lot with the Nazis. And I can tell you, those people had a mindset dogma, and everything had to fit that, and if it didn't, it was false. And others have had those kinds of things. So we try to identify our biases and set them aside. And then look at things from a factual point of view. I find there are three ways in which history is written. One is journalism, that people write the history to be interesting. And they emphasize the fun and the interesting kinds of things. Another is that they write it from an ideological point of view, pro-Nazi or anti-Nazi or whatever. And then they write scholarly. Well, now you know that scholarly is boring. Because scholarly has to be based on documents and on facts. And that's why Juanita Brooks is so important. Okay, I want to talk about three key works, one of which I'll bet you there's no one in this room that knows about. Here it is. Written in 1884 by a man named Charles Penrose, who was a member of the Quorum of the 12. He was asked to give an address on the Mountain Meadows Massacre, and he sweat over it like I did, and he wrote it and gave the address, and it was so popular that somebody else asked him to give another one, and so he wrote another one, and then they published the two of them in this little book. I would say that was the first attempt at reconciliation that the church made. He was a church official, he had access to materials, he wrote an amazingly good book. It's been completely forgotten. But I ran across it when I was a student, and I've judged things since then. All right, now, in the second book that all of you are familiar with, you cannot graduate from the Lee family until you have read Juanita Brooks' Mountain Meadows Massacre. All right, it's a required reading. It was written in 1950, so that was 70 years after this was written. A lot of things have been written in the meantime. You know some of the stories around the Juanita Brooks book, very interesting. Juanita Brooks was the Stake Relief Society president in the St. George Stake, which included a much bigger area than now. And you may have all heard the story of how she was a teacher down in Bunkerville, and an old man came into her classroom and said, "Young lady, I want you to come to my house, and I want to dictate a story to you." And she didn't really know much about him, and she had other things to do, and she put it aside. And then many months later, someone came rushing into her classroom and said, "Come right this minute." And this man was dying, and he was laying on his bed yelling about blood. And she later found out that he had been one of the people at the Mountain Meadows. And that event haunted her the rest of her life. Here she had passed up an opportunity to get an eyewitness account from a very important person. And from that time on, she had implanted in her mind that the story about the Mountain Meadows should be told. Now, it had been told before, but from her point of view, it was told either from ideology or from a mindset bias of ultra pro or ultra con. She thought it ought to be told from a scholarly point of view. Now, if you don't know a lot about Juanita, I had a chance to know her, and I've learned lots about her, and I know her son really well. And some of you may have this failing that she had. She wanted to write novels for women. She wanted to be a writer of romance. And she wrote some articles and got them published in women's magazines, but the career never took off. And there was a lady in the town she knew really well named Maureen Whipple, who wrote better than she did, and it frustrated her. And her father came to her and said, now look, if you want to write, here's an assignment. Write the biography of your grandfather, Dudley Levin. So she did, and she got hooked on history and became a historical writer rather than a fiction writer. Bless that father. Okay, so now she had written some things, and this pounds on her that this story has got to be told. Now here's another story you might not know about her. There was a thing called the Great Depression. She was the president of the Stake Relief Society. She had all of these women who were poverty-stricken. She was trying to think of how she could help these women make some money. She had a friend who worked for the federal government, and they had all of these programs that they were giving money for various things. And one of the programs was to give money to artists and writers. And she thumped something up. And she said, you know, I've been all over this county, and I can identify 100 journals that need to be typed and made and put in libraries. And she wrote to this friend in Washington, and he helped her, and she got a grant. And she got these journals. She identified a whole bunch of ladies. Can you remember carbon paper? Type 6 copies. Can you remember what happens when you make a mistake? All right, so she had all these ladies who were typing these journals. And so again, here she comes across journals that will have information about, sometimes referring to the Mountain Meadows. So she knew where there was a lot of information, and she finally decided, against the odds, because the general mindset in St. George was, let the story go. Don't stir it up. But she felt the story had not been told in a professional, scholarly way, and that would be a benefit to the church. So she went ahead and started writing. Now, she had access to, interestingly, in the temple in those days, they had quite an archive, and she had access to that, and she had access to these journals. She had access to everything that was in the State Historical Society, and she had quite a bit of information. She did not have access, nor any kind of sponsorship for the church. She had a very dear friend named Dale Morgan, who wrote the history of Great Salt Lake and was the head of the archives at the University of California, Berkeley. And he was deaf. And he encouraged her. But, you know, to us, Juanita Brooks is important. To the nation, Juanita Brooks was not even existing. First of all, she was in St. George, 4,000 people. She hadn't published anything of national significance. Dale Morgan said to her, now look, you're doing this the right way, but it's got to be published by a national press. Don't have it published in Utah. It won't have any impact of validity. It needs to be published by a national press. And I happen to know the people at Stanford University. And I will encourage them to read your manuscript. If you send it to them, they will say, who's Juanita Brooks? And they won't even read it. But I'll see that they read it. And so she sent the manuscript to Stanford University, and you know the rest of the story, because the leads are very important in it. So Stanford University, now how university presses are, they get the manuscript, they read it, they decide whether it's worth considering, then they send it to scholars to be a critic, 3 or 5 scholars. These scholars are not Mormons. They don't know her. They just read it for validity. And the decision was to publish it. And so they notified her that they were going to publish it, and things went along, and it got close to publishing, and then they started saying, who would read this book? I mean, we'll never sell more than 500 copies. And now if you want to know anything about business, you have to sell 3,000 copies to break even if you're a university press. They finally started backing off publishing it. The Lee family heard about it. Do you know the rest of the story?
No.
Eddie Lee found out that they were reconsidering publishing it. She went to Stanford and ordered 600 copies. And they published the book. I don't know a lot about Eddie Lee, and I don't know where she got the money, but I'm sure that everybody in this association in those days was required to buy the book from her. Okay, so the book is published. Some people at the church felt like it was going to be dangerous. But she says in the introduction, let me read to you in the introduction, page 20, very interesting statement. Page 20. This study is a very important sentence in here, which says that the church neither endorses nor criticizes the book. You couldn't ask for better. If the church had endorsed the book, no serious scholar who wasn't LDS would take it seriously. If they had condemned the book, nobody would buy it. So anyway, so the book came out. Let's see, I've told you, all right. Dale Morgan, Stanford University. Now, what was the impact of this book? It may not mean anything to you, but it means tremendous to me. It was the first book in Mormon studies that did this, that was based on letting the facts fall where they may and be judged outside the church and published outside the church. That became the formula thereafter for what became known as the New Mormon History. Soon thereafter, Leonard Arrington adopted her formula, wrote a very important book, got it published by Harvard University Press. Bill Mulder wrote an important book, got it published by Minnesota University Press. And a whole bunch of scholars who had graduated from university before World War II, went into World War II, came out after the war with the GI Bill, and went and got their doctor's degrees with the GI Bill. And they went to Berkeley and UCLA and those kinds of places, North Carolina, Chicago, Harvard, Minnesota. And they chose to write about Mormon history for a committee who were not Mormons. And when these books got published, they started a whole new thing. There must be now 200 of such books published by national presses, and of course this one is an example thereof. Okay, so Juanita's impact was just overwhelming. Okay, so now the question is, if we got this book, why this one? Okay, this one appears in 2008. Okay, so that's 58 years after this one. And this one's 58 years after this one. Now, as you know, the church is very much involved in this one. Why doesn't the church just let this one be? Well, you know that in the period following the Juanita Brooks book, books continued to be written. Magazine articles would continue to be written. And at the time that the thought about this book came to be, there was considerable anxiety because there was planned for a major motion picture. And it was well known that the people that were going to do it were very hostile to the church, and it was going to be, and it was advertised as an expose on the Mountain Meadows Massacre. So they knew they were going to get another slap in the back, slap in the face on this one, and some people started saying, well, what could we do? And you've met, Richard Turley has been here, right? Richard Turley is the assistant church historian, and he churned over this, and he knew exactly what the problem was. And that is that the church has never allowed the archives to be open to scholars on the topic of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. So he went to his boss, Marlon Jensen. I think most of you have seen him. He's been involved at the Meadows and so forth. He's the church historian, and he said, look, if we know we've got movies and books, we've already had the Bagley book, and we know that this is churning up, it is going to be a big thing, we need to do something. And I have just a modest little proposal. Open the church archives. Now, let's figure out how we can do this. And so they made a proposal. And they got it on paper, and Brother Jensen, I think, took it to who, I'm not sure, but eventually got to the First Presidency. And they said this: First Presidency, appoint some trusted scholars. Give them total open access to the church archives. That's what she didn't have. There's no reason to write another book unless they can have access to information that wasn't available to her. Give them complete access to the church archives, and then ask them to go to all the major universities and the National Archives and check and see if there's anything anywhere. And then the minute it's known that this is going to happen, hundreds of people will write them and say, I have an uncle who has 4 pages in his journal that talks about Nephi Jensen, or what, and you'll have endless stuff to look at. And your job is to look at everything, so we know it's going to take you a decade. It took 7 years. Then, write the book completely independent of us. Then, send what you've written out to all the scholars you know that know something about this, and get them to criticize it. They sent it out to 35 scholars. And of course, all the scholars felt obligated to write them 6 to 10 pages of corrections or suggestions. So that they churned through all of that. Then, send it to a national press. And then that national press will do the same thing. They'll send it out to 3 or 4 major scholars. And they chose the University of Oxford University Press. Oxford has an office in the United States and in London. And then, don't ask us to read it. Don't ask for any approval or corrections from us. We must stay out of it. And then it'll be published, and then, of course, once it's published, then they'll send it to all of the magazines, and the magazines will review it. And so it's an independent work, but it has access that has not been available before. So there it is. If you haven't read it, you will. It's a tremendously important book. Now, you'll notice that these 2 books are the same size, but Juanita Brooks does twice as much as these people do, in that she tells the story of the massacre, and then she goes on and tells the next 20 years of the trials and investigations. They just go up to the massacre, and they're going to do a second volume, I think Turley is, that deals with the investigations and the... So why is it the same size? Because half of it's footnotes. So you only have to read that much. And, okay, so what's the significance of the book? And what does the book generally say? Well, the significance is the thorough documentation. They made an interesting decision. I know so much about it, and you people all know so much about it, and so many people know so much about it, that I kind of thought they would write it to the specialists, and they would go into an analytical history. But they decided, no, we want to write this book to the general reader. And so it's a narrative. It just tells the story. And the great issues they put in where it gets to it in the story, instead of doing chapter by chapter over the great issues. So it's very readable. Okay, if I were to summarize what it says, I would say, number one, they say that the decision to kill the immigrants was a local decision. And they go into it in great detail. And they go through the councils and how the decision was made, and particularly the impact of some key people. And the person they focus in on mostly is Isaac Haight, but secondly, John D. Lee. And they show that they made decisions to reject their boss, William Dane, but to coerce him to William Dane was very much opposed to attacking the immigrants, but they finally got him to accept. And the key issue, of course, was whether to wait for the return of the instructions from Brigham Young. And you go into the details of why they chose to not wait, and the tension that they were under and so forth. I think most people should read this book, not because of anything to do with Southern Utah. There is a central issue, and they do a wonderful job on it, and that is the question of authority. Now, Haight was the stake president and the second in command of the military district. Dane was an ecclesiastical leader and the head of the military unit. So when Dane and Haight spoke, they had both secular and church authority. And they could tell people, this is what you're to do. Now, some key people, a man named Evan Morrill, said, no, we should not kill these people. They have not done anything that is worthy of that kind of punishment. And he was able to generate some support on the High Council and get a proposal passed that they send a message to Brigham Young and wait until that messenger returned to see whether they should attack the company. He thought he had it solved. He risked a lot of defying both the secular and religious authorities. There were several other people that were extremely uncomfortable with the order to attack the company. Some of them walked away, some of them expressed opposition, but went ahead and obeyed. So, and one of the key issues in the whole story is Jacob Hamlin, who wasn't there. It would have been fascinating to know what Jacob Hamlin would have done had he have been involved in the council decisions. So the thing that haunts me, what would I have done had I have been in Cedar City, either on the High Council or in the militia, when I was told to go to the meadow to kill those people? Now, a lot of people said, oh, we weren't told that. We were told to go there and bury the people that the Indians had killed. It doesn't hold too well. So I think that's a terrific challenge. Now, you also have to understand the mindset and the issues that were around these people. The key issue was the fear of an attack on southern Utah from the U.S. Army coming from California. And that if the immigrant company left the meadows and went to California, they would stimulate an attack on the people. And so, and the justification for all of this was that they were under mortal danger. Okay, the book is really tough on Isaac Haight. He is determined to force Dame to change his position. The book is tougher on John D. Lee than Juanita Brooks is. Why? Because they go into much more detail and have much more material available to them. What's the role of George A. Smith? They go into that in great details. To what extent can Brigham Young be blamed for the massacre? They go into great detail on that. A very interesting issue is the Indians. Man, is it a complicated matter. Jacob Hamlin is in Salt Lake City with about 6 chiefs conferring with Brigham Young. The chiefs get back in time to be involved in the massacre. Jacob Hamlin goes further north. But I'm sure you understand that because of the war, of the army coming against Utah, the Mormons are very concerned about the Indians. Now, something I hadn't understood was that there were 4 times as many Indians in southern Utah as there were whites. And it was absolutely required that the Mormons have a good relationship with the Indians, and they put a lot of effort into that. Because when there's a war between the United States and the Mormons, whoever has the Indians on their side is likely to win. And so they had worked hard to keep the Indians on their side. And so the Indian issue was very complicated and debated wildly after the massacre. Some people argued that the Indians never really were involved in the massacre. They were the first 2 days, but not really in the main massacre. They've done a lot of good research on that one. Now, one of the differences between this book and Juanita Brooks' book is the issue of what's the nature of the Fancher Company and their trip coming down. Juanita Brooks is pretty convinced that the Missouri part of the Fancher Company were really radical rebels, and that at least 5 places, maybe 8, there were clashes between the local people and parts of the company. And you know, the issue was that Brigham Young had ordered the people that they were not to sell any grain to anybody coming through. In fact, they were thinking that if the army got in, the people would abandon their towns, go up into the mountains, and fight a guerrilla war against the army. And so they were told to get their grain and materials up into the mountains, but not to allow any of it to be sold to the companies that were coming through. Well, then that seems to have been the basis under which there was clashes between the company and the townspeople. Also, a second company was 2 weeks behind them, and they were raising similar problems. Well, about 20 years after Juanita Brooks' book was published, a professor at Ricks College named Larry Coates, anybody heard of Larry Coates? Decided he would test what Juanita said. And Juanita said that they attacked them at Nephi and at Fillmore and Holden and on down, and then there was a big clash in Cedar. So he said, now if that happened, there needs to be contemporary records. See, here's what a historian does. He goes to find evidence. There would be contemporary records. The people who were attacked would write it in their journal that very day. And so he started examining everything he could find in those towns. And they mentioned the group, but they didn't mention the attacks. Now, they did mention them in a couple of places, but about 3 or 4 of them, they didn't mention them. And so Larry Coates says, all right, now what does this mean? Does it mean that the attacks happened and nobody recorded them? That's possible. Did it mean that the attacks didn't happen in some places? That's possible. Or did it mean that after the massacre, everybody in southern Utah was concerned and started building the case against the Fancher Party? And started then inventing or expanding. You've never heard any kind of expansion of folk tales or anything like that. Let me give you an example. Right outside this wall is the temple, and on top of the temple there's a tower. And you all know the story, that when it was originally built it was short. And 5 years after Brigham Young's death it was struck by lightning, and people said, Brigham Young didn't like that tower, he finally got his way and they built a better tower. Well, recently a person did a study on that and there is no evidence at all of Brigham Young saying he didn't like that tower. But in 1977, when this was rededicated, there was an article in the Spectrum that said that, and ever since then, go down to the Tabernacle, they'll tell you that story. They don't tell it anymore. Okay, the expansion of stories, did that happen? So when these authors sat down to write this, they got to figure that out. They got to take Juanita's stories, and they got to go check with cults, and then they've got to go and find out. And they end up with about 3 attacks instead of 7. And the one in Cedar City is pretty important, but they make it clear in the Cedar City that most of the Fancher Company did not come into Cedar City. They went around, but a group did go through and wanted to buy whiskey. And anyway, so they modified that a little bit. So whenever you write a great book like Juanita did, I can promise you, 50 years later, the new young bucks are going to come up with new information. And these used to be young bucks at my age. Okay. Well, let's see. So then you get into the details of the actual decision. They go into it in great depth, and you look closely. One of the things I didn't realize, is that some people in Cedar City secretly did sell against the instructions. At night, a guy named Jackson sold 50 bushels of grain and whiskey. No, whiskey doesn't come in bushels. Okay. And then the claims that these guys threatened them and were going to go bring back the army, and that one of them said he had the revolver that killed Joseph Smith, and on and on and on. They go into all of those things. Well, I've said enough. This book will be unsettling to you. It's tougher than the Juanita Brooks book because it has access to much more information. Here's a funny thing. When the press published it, they printed 3,000 copies. That's the estimate of what will happen on a boring academic book. Well, the 3,000 copies were sold before they left the press. Then they printed 50,000. I don't know what it is now, but I'm sure that they're on their 3rd printing by now. The book has received both criticism and rave reviews. All right, now, who wants to talk about Bagley? Anybody read Bagley's book? Okay. Obviously, he's going to be critical. He interviewed me, and I warned him. I said, now, Will, you're a journalist. No, I'm a scholar. Well, there's some scholars who are journalists and some journalists who are scholars. He wrote the book, and then after he wrote the book, he wrote an introduction, which is the way you always do it. You don't write the introduction before you write the book. And in the introduction, he said, an author must be unbiased. He must work on his bias, just as I told you at the beginning. Then he writes a book that is biased. And here's his bias. He said, Brigham Young is responsible for the Mountain Meadows Massacre. What is the evidence? Now, when you read this one and when you read Juanita Brooks, you have access to the letter that Brigham Young sent back. You have access to everything that happened in the Brigham Young office. he says, no, you got to understand this. Utah was a theocracy. Everything that happened in Utah was under the command of Brigham Young. Therefore, the Mountain Meadows Massacre was ordered by Brigham Young. I said to him, Will, all grass is green. Therefore, everything green is grass. I'm sorry, that kind of logic is not historical evidence. You've got this letter that Haslam brought back. You've got to prove that that letter didn't exist, or that it's a phony copy, or whatever, that Brigham Young actually sent a letter and ordered the massacre. No, I don't have to do that. Nobody could do anything in Utah that wasn't what Brigham Young ordered. That is a bunch of malarkey. Brigham Young had 300 communities. They didn't have a handbook. They didn't have a telegraph. There was no way he could control all the things that went on. Anyway, that's my objection to go back to this book. By the way, it's very well written. He's a good writer. But he is determined, his life's crusade is to prove that Brigham Young ordered the massacre. So far, now, you know, this may someday, somebody came along with some new documents and showed that they're not right. But their point is that those who stood up against hate, particularly, and said, we will not do it, it is not justified, until Brigham Young gives us an order to do it, and that order came exactly the opposite, not to do it after it was done. Okay, who wants to give a counter attack, a question, a comment, and then I'll get out of here. Yes?
I'd like to ask a question just a week ago on Channel 2. Bagley and Leonard sat down together, and they talked about the 35 journalists that you talked about that reviewed all this information. And the subject come up from Bagley. Well, this book you're talking about here, Bagley don't have a lot of faith in that book. But he said Turley and Leonard worked for the church. They wrote the book.
That's right.
He says, well, if that, Turley and Leonard has stated that information comes from the documents of the church, if that be the case, why don't they open the documents up to these journalists? I mean, the documents have never been opened to the public. If that's the case, why don't they open them?
All right.
That's all I need this back.
Now, every one of us today should stand up and say how grateful we are to live in America. America's a free country, and it's very important that we'll be able to criticize the book, and the book is vulnerable on 2 or 3 points. One, the authors were paid by the church for 7 years to write the book. So they probably, you can just say, they have a stake in wanting to prove that Brigham Young did not order it.
I agree with that.
That's point one. Now, number 2, why don't you just open the documents to everybody, especially Bagley? Now, if you walk into the United States Army and ask to have access to their archives, I can assure you, you won't get it.
But you have not the right book, you're not going to open the document.
Then you just simply, okay, let me give you a case in point. Franklin Delano Roosevelt plotted to cause Pearl Harbor to occur so he could get the public opinion to support the war. That's straight BS, but you can say it. But you can't get documents to prove it, and the military is not going to give you access to them. You can't get the access to Zion Bank's documents. You can have access to Dixie College's documents because it's a state institution. But getting access is not easy, and the church took a step by making them open to those people, but Backley is deservedly right to say, why not the next step? Why don't you open it to Jan Ships? And especially, why don't you open it to Will Backley? Of course, they don't trust Will. And on and on. So Will has a couple of very good points, and it's tremendously important that he says it right in front of Will Leonard and the rest of the world. This is not the last thing that's ever going to be written on it. Thanks.
I'd like to know how many you read the book.
Oh, the bishop wants to know how many times you've been to the temple this week. We're not going to force him, but we strongly encourage you to read it. But I tell you right now, it isn't going to be easy reading. Oh, I got to the last 2 chapters and I said, I don't want to read this a second time. It is awful. And particularly because you have a big stake in this. So, don't expect it to be simple and easy.
Paints a very poor picture of John Lee, which is.
It paints a very poor picture. Now, I'd like to use different words. It paints a critical picture of John Lee. But is it an inaccurate one? Now, of course it's got to be inaccurate.
I hope so.
She just told us what her mindset is, and she deserves her mindset, and she should keep her mindset. But all of us should allow our mindset to be attacked. I just think that's very important, that we should have our mindset attacked.
Well, a long time ago, I was told that John Newby kept a really good journal through that time period, and that those pages were removed from his journal, and I'm hoping that these scholars had access to those pages.
Oh, they did not.
Brenda Alder, would you repeat the question?
She said that John D. Lee kept a very good journal, and that the pages dealing with the massacre have been taken out. And so if your name was, who's the guy that's in prison for manufacturing? Hoffman, my student. If your name's Hoffman, what you should do is fabricate those pages and sell them for a lot of money. We don't know what's happened to the pages. Please?
I'd like to see the church documents. John D. Lee's the one that reported this incident to Brigham Young. He wrote very good diaries to 1846.
But isn't it interesting that when he reported it to Brigham Young, he did not mention that any Mormons were involved in the massacre. It was just Indians.
Well, if you understand, the Indians were causing a lot of problems
Uh-huh.
in Utah and all down through that was generated by Brigham Young.
You've got to understand, that's right, Brigham Young changed the policy as a result of the war. And here's a little thing you may not have thought about. When the Mormons came into southern Utah, they upset the Indians' economy because they brought cattle, and the cattle ate the seeds that they'd been living from. And so the Paiutes went into the cattle business. And their job was to get cattle. And they saw these companies coming through as a great place to steal cattle. And the Mormons too.
Who told them they could have those cattle?
That's right. Brigham Young said he was not going to protect them anymore. So, it's a complicated issue. Way back there.
I just talked to Brother Terry about a week ago. I'm Toma Honeyman from Copeland. He was very critical in his book of John D. Lee, which I was very upset about. But he told me personally after the talk that I asked him, how did you feel about him personally? He said he was a very violent man. He abused his wives. And he said, knocked one of his wives down and kicked her. And I said, how do you know that? And he said, we have documentation. I'd sure like to see it.
Yeah. Isn't it fascinating? You all know that in the back of this book, after the book was published, the church reinstated John D. Lee, and so there is a page in here that talks about that reinstatement. Yeah.
I went to a meeting that Richard Curry gave for the people that came
In Arkansas?
Arkansas.
What was the question?
And afterwards, I went over and talked to him, and I said, it's obvious that you're not going to leave out December. He said, I have a certain not, and I'm proud of it.
So she said she went to the meeting in Arkansas where Richard Turley spoke to the people, and afterwards she went up to him and said, well, obviously you're not a descendant of John D. Lee. He says, I'm not, and I'm proud of it. That's why I'm telling you that it's not going to be an easy book, because this book does not deal with John D. Lee very much. It skirts the issues on John D. Lee in a couple of points, and this book may deal with it too much. But, yeah.
If they would ask some of the lead descendants a little bit of their history on John D. Lee, we've all got some, it has been handed down to us through John D. Lee. We know that his wife loved John D. Lee.
I don't know if and who they talk to in the John D. Lee movement. Yes, last one.
Well, I just think that, it's all a mystery, and none of us really knows exactly. I mean, documents or not, there's still so much that conversation that would have been had between John D. Lee and the others and Brigham Young, and besides the fact of the Lord's knowledge of people's hearts and intents, and whether mistakes were made or not. And the way I see it is, here's a man who sacrificed so much to come across the plains, wasn't even a member of the first company to go through because he was asked to stay behind and help build up winter quarters so the rest of the company could safely come through. We're talking lots and lots of people to save their lives. Then he comes in and is asked to go down to Dixie after living in Holiday, and I don't know a lot, I just know a little. But I know how I would feel if I were living in a place that I loved and had to be called to go down south and build it up again for more people. He's being asked to do so much over and over and over for the saints, for the church, for other people. He takes on 19 wives or however many, takes care of all these children. This isn't a man who abused his wives. This is a man who may have made some mistakes. Who knows? I certainly don't. But I see this as a person who's giving and giving and giving and giving, and then, is faced in this situation where, after all this being driven out from Illinois, having their prophet who he protected murdered in front of their very eyes, I see this as these are men that were very disappointed, fearful, whatever. I don't know what happened, but I can just say that if it were me, I wouldn't want a whole bunch of people pointing fingers at me after I'd done all of what I had done for other people.
One of the things you said there is important. They spend a whole chapter on what we call the mindset of the people at the times. And they talk about all the people that are there that were at Hans Mill, the people who were kicked out of Missouri, the people who saw Joseph killed, the people who came and that now here they are in Cedar City, and the possibility exists. There's an army coming up in Wyoming. There's a possibility of an army coming from California, and they say, not again. We refuse to be kicked out. And Brigham Young says the same thing, and so he says to them, mobilize, get ready to fight these people, stop it. Judge A. Smith comes down and stirs the war mentality all over the state, but particularly down here. And these people who have this feeling of vengeance, this feeling of being abused, become really what they call a war hysteria. And into it comes the Fancher Party. They argue that the failures of the Fancher Party were not really very significant, certainly not anything worth being executed for. but they did do some indiscretions, and there were some people in it who were really boisterous and insulting. And there were people in Cedar City and Parowan who said, you know, just, they're gonna leave, let's just let it go. And there were people who say these guys need to be taught a lesson. But the mindset at the time, you know, we're not in that. But let me remind you, every 3 or 4 nights when you watch the news, you see something like the Mountain Meadows Massacre going on between the Palestinians and the Israelis and the various Arab countries and in Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda and so forth. And you say, this is impossible. How could people ever do this kind of thing? Well, read the Mountain Meadows Massacre and imagine yourself there, and the intensity and the danger. The Mountain Meadows Massacre story is one of the most important stories. For Mormons, I think it is a tremendously important story, because it's us. And I don't know how I would have reacted. I'm very pro-authority. I've used authority, I've obeyed authority, but I know, now some of you may understand this, you've heard of the Cowley case. When I went through basic training, I was told that it was my duty to obey an order. When they go through boot camp today, they are told it is your duty to obey a correct order. This means you have to decide if the commander was correct, and if he isn't, you can't say, if I do it, it's the commander's fault. Hope you all know the story of the Cowley case. A lot of the people at Mountain Meadows said, I don't want to do this, but I've been ordered by civil and religious authorities. I will do it, and it's their responsibility. That isn't what the gospel teaches. We are responsible for our own decisions. Authority is very important, but we can't just duck our responsibility and say, I'm just following orders. That's the thing I get most out of it, is once the decision was made, it was clear to some people that that was not the correct decision. And what would you and I have done if we had been in that circumstance? Have some fun. I'm going to quit. Unfortunately, I had another meeting, so
We thank you.
thank you.
Very, very much.
Are we allowed to clap, or are we supposed to just?
Are we allowed to what?
Clap for you.
No. This is the challenge. Just don't hang me.
You're not looking for us.
Thank you, thank you.
They clapped in the chapel at the musical concerts.
The 3 members of the family presidency saw good reason to ask that we have the theme of remembering and reconciliation. The reason why those 2 things go together is that one many times can follow the other depending upon the mindset of the one who remembers. We are indebted to President Alder. We are indebted to members of this group who had something to do with the origin of the book that he featured particularly. 2 of those members are sitting with us today. They were given the opportunity of reading the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, or 4th draft. I can't remember which one it is. And they could say a great deal to us, in addition to what we have heard that was good from President Alder. I am a little bit conflicted at this moment about whether we might want to turn to those 2 people and ask for additional. But I think if you plowed the ground enough, and what is enough, that it's time to move on with remembering other things about John Doyle Lee. And I find in them personally the joy that comes from knowing that I have some DNA in me allows me to remember what he did. And I only remember because I've written about it and been told about it. And I don't at all mean to do a critique on what we've heard from President Holder. That's not the point. The point is we thank him. We thank you for your questions. Is it all right if I say there will never be a total end to this? Can I also add that several here, including myself, would hope that that would be the case? Speak a little louder so I can repeat your question.
Richard Curry, why did they assign him to it when he had that page for John B. Lee?
There's no answer to that one, because we don't know their mindset as they approved what he was going to do. We don't know whether they called him and directed him, or whether he developed that thought all by himself and went to them and said, open up these. We don't know that. If we don't know it, then we can't speak from facts. We speak from guesses. The question might occur to you, but not one that we can answer. We're going to call on this young man who has a question. Speak up.
There are people who can't hear. I'm one of them. I'm very
Yes, I'd like to hear the question.
Please stand and repeat your question.
I'll try to do that. The reason why I didn't do it the last time was because, in my humble opinion, there was no answer that could be given to it that was factual. Let's have a question.
I want to hear the question.
All right, very good.
The question was, why was Richard Turley chosen to write this book when he had so much hate?
That's the same question I was asked before. And what I hear you saying is
What
that
I'm saying, it may have been possible that he was chosen on other qualities. That, like he done good work on this, on that, and that his attitude, his mindset was not known when he was called.
is it all right if I leave that as an open question at this point, simply because I lack any ability on the basis of facts to answer it? Is that reasonable? Jared. Jared is one of the people who read one of the first drafts of this along with Vern Lee. And whether we want to get into the whole critique or not, I don't know, but we're going to ask him to ask the question.
I'm going to speak in defense of Richard Turley. As I understand it, and I'd say that he is a saint for having gone for 7 or 10 years of his life and having everybody explain to him what really happened at the Mountain Mills Massacre.
Can you hear Brother Smith?
Can you turn around this way and just stand up?
Turn.
I'd take the mic if they give it to me. Would you give me the mic for him or not? You're presiding here, but...
That's a good question. Yes, please.
Hold it out. Hold on, Jared. Just stand right here.
Got it. I want to speak in defense of Richard Turley. I gave you my basis for doing it. First, I want to say that I think that he is a true saint to have spent 7 years or 10 years of his life listening to people tell him what really happened at the Mountain Meadows Massacre and informing him of what the true facts were. And keeping a straight face as they did it. In this book, you'll find that myself, my sister Renee Durfee, Talana Hooper, my sister, and I don't know if they mentioned my mother's name there, but we met with him. And that wasn't at his invitation, that was at my invitation, but he met with us for more than an hour. And I came away from that with the impression that if you took the 3 most knowledgeable Lee historians and put them together, about the Mountain Meadows Massacre, Richard Turley by himself would run circles around them. He just knows so much more than we know. We have a different set of information that he has. We have facts that come from family history, and we have our Lee family myth, which is now a part of history. He signed my copy of it, fell class of 1985. He and I went through law school together in the same year, just in different halves of the class. He was in the upper half of the class, and I thought I was going to be in the same half as him, but I didn't quite make it. I have, since 1983, respected his intellect and his abilities. I don't think that he's a fan of John D. Lee, but I don't know that he's necessarily an enemy. But as I understand it, the church did not select him to do this job. He selected the job and asked for permission to do it, is what I understand. So he wasn't called by the church to do this. I've heard him speak on different occasions, and the story that he has given, however accurate it may be, is that he thought it was something that needed to be done, and he took it upon himself and brought other people in with him to do it. So as far as him being tagged by the church and assigned to do it, I think it was the other way around. He thought that the truth needed to be told, and I think that he's doing as good a job as he knows. And just as we have our mindset, he has his mindset. We are going to be tremendously pleased to learn the things that he has learned about the aftermath. He is a friend to us because he knows so much more about it than we do, and he can help us understand that. I hope someday that he'll be addressing this meeting and telling us more about the trials of John D. Lee and the actual things. One of the things that he told us that I think is incredibly valuable to the families, it says, we believe that we can identify in Mormonism Unveiled and John D. Lee's biographies that which he wrote and that which was inserted by him. And what a wonderful thing that would be for us. But anyway, I stood up in defense of Richard Turley's character, even though we don't share some of the same mindsets and myths.
We appreciate that, Jared. We appreciate your willing to share with us your point of view. We are not here to hold an inquiry, nor an inquisition, nor give judgment. In fact, we are here to remember the contributions of John Doyle Lee and his wives and his posterity to us personally, and then be in a position to do something in our lives that is consistent with the truth of the principles that John D. Lee exemplified in many, many areas of his life. I'd like you to know that this afternoon we're going to be pleased to hear about one of those and more. I'll tell you which one it was, who we're going to hear from. We're going to hear from the district judge, Wallace Lee, and he's going to enter a short period of time and ask you to enter with him as we see John D. Lee face an issue that could have resulted in his total, I don't know the legal term, and a method of making money enough to support several wives and several families, which was his great concern. I won't say more about that because I'd like to hear what Judge Lee has brought together and will speak to us about it this afternoon. Can we do this now for a moment? Can you stand and kind of get the clots out of your leg veins? If we could come to order once again, please. When you came in today, have you noticed that
I'm
several
so
people
sorry,
said,
I didn't
"And
think
which
about
wife are you from?"
recording
well,
it.
now, if you married into the family, you say, "I don't know many of them."
That's
No,
why I'm
yes, you are, because you married someone who comes through the line of John D. Lee, or you wouldn't be here. So we'd like you to adopt yourself within the framework of the Lee family, and you have other families too. So as you recognize that good things happen in your life as you are part of another family, then you realize the whole plan, and that is that families are where it is. And families form the basis of the help that we absolutely have to have before we reach that day when we stand before Him in final judgment. So, have you noticed the paintings of the wives on the chairs in the culture hall? Please look very carefully at them. Also, look at the, what do you call those? The demonstration of some of the areas in Vandalia and Kaskaskia and Randolph County, Illinois, that were the birthplace and the foundation of our ancestor John D. Lee and his first wife. They are very interesting. It takes you a while to look at them, but I would recommend that you look at them. They're very interesting. And then the paintings of the wives of John D. Lee, not all of them, but many of them. We have the person here who did that. Now, if you're not impressed with the ability to paint a portrait, I hope you live long enough to get that way. And if I ask her to stand, that'll be all right. If I don't ask her to stand, it'll be all right. But she did that. Each one of those, laboriously. And so, as we are here, would it be all right if we just asked how many of you came through Agatha Ann Woolsey? Raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. All right, the 16 of you are now going to elect a spokesman for everyone here who came through Agatha Ann. And what he or she is going to do is stand up and say, these are the things that we as a family remember that came down to us, hopefully factually, and things that have happened in the offspring of Agatha Ann Woolsey. Would you do that? You're president of the Agatha Ann Woolsey organization. Stand. Well, wasn't he elected?
The great-grandson of
Can you come out to the podium?
Here's a microphone right here. We lend it to you without a fee. Agatha Ann.
I'm not a public speaker, but
Don't care.
anyway, I came through Agatha Ann, and my great-grandfather was John Allen. So
John who?
Allen,
John Allen.
if you wanted to try and follow the descendants as it comes down through.
Put the mic toward your mouth,
So,
please.
if you take from those children that came from Agatha Ann, you would run into these people in life. There were 11 children that ranged from William Oliver. He died at childbirth back in Illinois. Elizabeth Adele Lee, she passed away at childbirth. The older children were Sarah Jane Lee, that many of you would recognize even from Rachel's children. Of course, Rachel was a sister to Agatha Ann. But I'll name the other children that came from our side was Sarah Jane Lee, John Alma Lee Jr., Mary
Put the
Adele,
microphone up to right now.
Mary Adele,
Make an ice cream cone out of it.
Joseph Hiram Lee, Herbert John Lee, he died in infancy, John Willard Lee, there's some of his descendants I've met here, Louisa Adeline Lee, there's lots of those here, quite a few of them, and Samuel Gillen Lee.
Golly.
Huh?
Golly.
Okay. And Ezra Taft Lee, and I don't know whether any of his descendants are here or not. Okay. So that was our descendants, and I'll turn it over to somebody else.
That's excellent, excellent. Do any of you now have, in addition to that, saying anything about a family tradition through Agatha Ann that you feel like we might want to listen to? Please. Yes. Take the microphone back, or maybe you can come forward.
Hold on, it's unplugged.
Wait just a minute, we'll plug that microphone in the system.
My grandmother was Eliza Evelyn Lee. She was the ninth child of John D. Lee and Agatha Ann. And it was at her home they took John D. Lee's body. People have the idea that John D. owned that home, but he didn't. That was my grandmother's home, and he was captured at the next corner, or with Caroline, on the opposite corner of the block. I'd like to get that straightened out. My mother, when she was a young woman, said that her mother said to her one day, "I wish there was something that could be done for my father." So at that moment, Mother started genealogy, and she's the one author of the Red Book. And I typed every page of that book, every letter of that book. And I'm very proud of her. And she loved our grandfather very, very much.
Was that Manetta Henry or something?
That's Manetta Henry, yes. I'm her daughter.
Can we just, for a moment, just stand and look at you and give you a message through our eyes?
Thank you. I'm nearly 90 years old, and
You know,
don't stand here too well.
are you aware of what message we're giving you as we look at you?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Is it still available?
Send it to John D. Lee is the book I'm referring to.
Yes. Yeah, the first one.
Is it still available?
No. However, it is on the computer.
Yes, the whole thing is on the internet. Or if you find a copy in some used bookstore, buy it.
What's the title?
Descendants of John D. Lee.
By Manetta Henry.
Manetta Henry. Yes.
You get on the internet too.
Yes. Carmen, Jared, can you reach over and put your mouth against her ear and tell her we're going to hear from her in a minute so she can be thinking about something? Sarah Caroline Williams. Members who Sarah Caroline Williams, raise your hand. 1, 2. 2. We want you to take the microphone and give a little report on Sarah Caroline Williams. Anything you want to say. Make it about Sarah Caroline Williams.
Sarah Caroline Williams was born in Coshika, something like that, anyway.
Kaskaskia.
Kaskaskia.
Get it close to your mouth.
Okay, Sarah Caroline was born in Kaskaskia, Illinois, and no, not Illinois, it's Tennessee. And she met John D. Lee. He was a missionary, and she joined when she was 10 years old. And she went with Lee Stewart and his family to Far West, and she was living with them. And then she married him in the Nauvoo Temple when she was like 13, wasn't it? 13. And then she went to, but she didn't live with him. She was just married to him, is the way I understood it. And then she went to across the Mississippi when that happened. And she found when John D. Lee went to get the Mormon Battalion money, they were left, the family was left, the wives were left alone, and she went with her uncle, with her aunt. She came and got her, and she went back, and then after John D. Lee and his family settled in Cottonwood area, she came back out and was lived with him again. And then she was living in New Harmony, or Old Harmony, when that building collapsed. And she and two of her children died there, and they're buried in New Harmony. And
We didn't know that. I didn't know that. Thank you.
and then she moved to Panguitch. She was going to go out with them to Scoot-and-Paw in that area, and then she decided to go to Panguitch to live. And that's where my family all is. That's where her family is.
Thank you.
And I think that's all you need to know.
Thank you. That's a contribution. That's a good contribution. We know something we didn't know before. We thank you. Rachel?
Question.
Yes, please.
Was, the family that lived in Panguitch, was that one of the reasons why John D. was taken to Panguitch after his execution to be buried?
The family went over and got him and took him to Panguitch. And Grandma, I heard, said that her father, that's Harvey Parley Lee, and their family, his brothers, buried him in Panguitch.
John Alton Lee was the oldest boy.
He says John Alton Lee was the oldest boy of the brothers. And the brothers were kept away at the time of the execution. Yeah. Rachel and Dora Woolsey. Now that gets pretty personal for me. Raise your hand. Rachel and Dora Woolsey, the younger sister of Agatha and Woolsey. Thank you. Did you get a present left? Gary, tell us anything recent about Rachel and Dora Woolsey.
Well, of course, Rachel was the most well-beloved of all the I'm just kidding.
Yes, you are.
Just finding out if we're all awake. I think Rachel is the one that ended up in Greer, Arizona, after the death of John D. Lee. In fact, at the Molly Butler Lodge in Greer, they don't have numbers on the motel rooms, they have names. So they have a name on one of their rooms, Rachel and Dora Woolsey Lee. And I'm sure there's a lot more that she can be remembered for, but it was a shock to me when we went to that lodge. And we didn't actually stay in that room, but we heard about it. And I don't know a lot about Rachel and Dora Woolsey Lee, except for she was one of the 5 Woolsey daughters. And Agatha was the oldest, and Rachel was one of the younger ones. Anybody else have anything they want to add? All right.
This may be news to some of you, but I was talking to my grandmother, Effie Lee, who was a granddaughter of Rachel, and asked her about her memories. She said she smoked a corncob pipe. And then...
Cedar bark in it, right?
I don't know. But she said she also liked to brew root beer. And Nana was eventually able to convince her that it violated the word of wisdom. She says, no, I like the root beer. It's not against the word of wisdom and it makes me feel good.
Is she the only side of the family that ended up in the Gila Valley?
No.
Were there any others that settled in the Gila Valley?
My granddad Ottilie was there as well.
Okay,
He after John David Lee, which was Lavania.
okay.
Lavania,
Correct.
yes,
Very good, thank you.
thank you. Mary Vance, Polly Young. Loiza Free. Loiza Free. Mary Leah Groves. Yes, please. Could you take a, Lenny, can you help us on that?
If I get a little emotional, excuse me, but Stella Shamel, who usually gives this little dissertation, passed away last. And I had promised her that I would stand in for her, so I hope you understand. In keeping with Stella's attitude about the women, the wives, the mothers of all of us, she felt that they needed to be acknowledged for their spunkiness, their stick-to-itiveness, and in keeping with that, I'm going to read what she wrote, and then I'll give you a little aside about Mary Leah Groves that might be interesting to you. My name is Mary Leah Groves, daughter of Elisha Hurd Groves and Lucy Simmons. I was born October the 4th, 1836, in far west Caldwell County, Missouri. My father, Elisha Hurd Groves, accepted the gospel in 1832, but his wife, Sarah Hoke, did not feel the same. She said that he had so disgraced her and her family by associating with the Mormons, and now to accept the gospel was more than she could stand. So she took their 2 children and went to live with her parents. Her brothers told him that if he tried to see them, they would kill him. This was a great blow to my father. So he thought if he would go on a mission, maybe when he returned she would have a change of heart, but she didn't. She obtained a divorce and sold all of our property, so he spent the next few years doing missionary work. On one of these missions, he met and married Lucy Simmons, 19th of January, 1936. Lucy's family had lived in and around the Bristol, Massachusetts area since the early 1700s. They were a well-established and well-to-do family. After being driven from place to place, they finally moved to Nauvoo, Illinois. Several children were born to them by this time. One time, the mob came to the Groves home and told the family if they did not denounce Mormonism, they had 1 hour to leave. If by that time they were not gone, the mob would come back and kill them. That night, during a terrible rainstorm with no shelter except quilts dragged around their wagon, Lucy gave birth to one of her children. There were 9 babies born that night to families who had been driven from their homes. In 1846, the Mormon Battalion was organized, and you all know John Dewey's part in that. I should say that Mother's 2 brothers joined, leaving Jane's daughters with our family to bring to Utah. On the 7th of May, 1848, Mother gave birth to her 6th child. 10 days later, we started for the Rocky Mountains. Our teams consisted of a yoke of cows and a yoke of wild steers. One of Father's cows had been killed by the mob. After about 3 weeks on the trail, Mother asked Father if she could get out of the wagon and walk. I wouldn't have done that, probably. I probably would have stayed in the wagon. He didn't want her to, but after she insisted, he reluctantly said yes. As she was climbing out of the wagon, the front wheel went into a rut in the road, spooking the wild steers, and they lunged forward, thus throwing Mother under the front wheel and running over her chest, breaking 3 ribs. Father tried to grab Mother out from under the wagon, but not soon enough for the back wheels to run over her leg, resulting in a compound fracture. A doctor was summoned and he bandaged her leg, and she got gangrene in it, and she said she would have to have it amputated, but she refused. He cleaned the wound, and after a week or so it started to heal. I was 12 at the time. I had all the responsibility of cooking, washing, and caring for 6 younger children and infant and my injured mother. One day in my hurry to fix our evening meal, I accidentally stumbled over my mother's broken leg and re-broke it. Oh, the guilt feelings I felt after all the pain my mother had gone through, and now more because of my carelessness. And I find it interesting that at 12 years old, can you find any child that age today that would take care of a family like that? Or feel responsible for a child's action? After a few days on the road, my mother told my father that she could go no farther. They would have to go back. No one was allowed to break trail once the company started, but my father pulled the wagon from the train. Soon President Brigham Young came riding on his horse to see what the matter was. President Young, I cannot go one step farther, my mother said. Now again, the pain is so severe, we will have to turn back. President Young said, Sister Rose, do you think for a moment that we will leave you here at the mercy of what? Indians? Mobs? Starvation? He took a saw and sawed the legs off the bed, and with the rope thrown over the bows of the wagon, he made a hammock for my mother. He spent many hours with her, praying and comforting her, and telling her she would yet reach the Rocky Mountains and raise a family. Mother was always crippled after that, using a cane or crutches to walk. We finally reached the Great Salt Lake. When I was 16 years old, I married John Doyle and had 7 children by him. I visited my parents as often as I could. I didn't have a home of my own. I shared another sister wife's home. So one day I asked my husband if I could go stay with my parents for a while. He thought this would be a good idea. He said my children would be a great help to their grandparents, so he moved me to Tokerville, where my parents lived. John came to visit me often. Then he said it was time for me to go home. John, I said, do you think for one moment I could leave my mother here now? Father is gone, and I cannot leave my mother to the mercy of the neighbors. So I stayed. Things began to be strained between John and me. Finally, I asked John for a divorce. Later, I married Daniel Matthews. I had 3 children by him. We moved to the community of Virgin City, Utah. My mother moved also. Many of my descendants live in southern Utah, thus ending both of our lives. We are buried in the Virgin City Cemetery. And I'm from that town. I was the last child delivered by the old midwife up there, so that kind of dates me. But anyway, when she married Daniel Willis Matthews, this is a side note I'm getting to. He had a son named Daniel Willis Matthews Jr. He had a daughter named Amy Leah Matthews. They had a son named Raymond, and that's my husband. So we are both descended from this really great, courageous woman. And Lucy Simmons is actually buried in Tokerville, and one of our John D. Lee cousins had a headstone made for her and put it in Tokerville with Elisha Herdgroves. And my mother had to tell him he's going to have to pick it up and move it again because she's in Virgin. And I'm also the town historian up there, and I was doing an editing of Charles Adelbert Workman, and the Workman family has adopted me. And in his journal, it gave the specific date that their home burned down in Virgin, which I thought was quite interesting. So I kind of do the history for Mary Leah Groves on both sides of the family.
Thank you, Lenny. Thank you very, very much. We have all been aware of Stella's passing. And
I didn't be asked, but I can add about 2 minutes stuff about Rachel Andorra. She was born in Kentucky in 1812, I think, and her father was a minister. Was his name Joseph or was it Thomas? I think it was Joseph. I'm 92, forgive.
Carmen put it, yes.
But anyway, as they crossed the continent, you can pick them up in the census, and hold them up closer,
yes.
And when I find quite a number of people married by this minister. Anyway, they came all the way to Illinois, all right? So John D. Lee and Rachel Andorra got married. I'm going to go into, don't have to tell it all, you know. But when he died, she moved, as you know, a lot of the women didn't have anybody to support them. And Rachel Andorra was one of them. And they moved down into northern Arizona they were in Moenkopi. And I think Joseph Hiram, Rachel Andorra, the older Agatha Ann's son, had that property. But John D. Lee built a cabin there in Moenkopi that I got to see. Oh God, I didn't take a picture of it. I didn't know he built it. But anyway, they moved and they were out of provisions. And my grandfather went and helped, took a wagon and brought some. All right, now, after she'd been there for a while, a man named Isaac Hale up the river, his house burned. And all of his kids were barefoot, didn't have any way. And the only place they could go was down to Aunt Maury Smithson's house. That resulted in Isaac Hale, the father, and Rachel Andorra getting married. I think they had a pretty good, happy marriage, but he knew too much about some cattle rustlers. And what do you know? Rachel Andorra had another husband who was shot. Now, how I found out about that, my grandfather thought that my grandmother was the most fabulously beautiful woman there ever was in the world. He was very jealous. I saw where he and a man named Hale went from Arizona to northern Arizona. Now, this is really crazy. My grandfather would no more let that woman go off with another unmarried man, and the man in the moon. What is going on here? And then I found out about the marriage, that she had been married to this Isaac Hale, who seemed to be a wonderful man. Rachel Andorra stayed with my grandfather there up the river, Cactus, Lebanon. He was bishop of the Lebanon Ward. And my mother said, I never saw Rachel Andorra read a book, or I thought she couldn't read, I thought she couldn't write. Oh, you know, this is not so. But that's what my mother assumed. She also smoked a pipe. And my mother said that she often cut the plug and filled her little pipe for her to do. She first lived with her son, the oldest one, until he got married. He got married late in life. And then she moved around up to Gila, New Mexico, and then down to where we are. And she's buried out there in where she lived with my grandfather. Now, that wasn't well organized.
Yes, it was.
That I got asked real quick. But I had to tell you that about her.
That was very well.
Maybe that Lee stuff is bit with me too, so I had to tell.
Thank you. Now, Nancy Bean, please. Nancy Bean.
Nancy Dalton.
Nancy Bean. Ann Gorge. You know, I know something about these wives, but I guess we'll go on. Martha Elizabeth Berry. Yes, please.
I'm through Agatha, but I am videotaping for one thing for descendants of Ann Gorge that are very dear to me and I've known my whole life. And they found the grave site for her in Provo and in the Provo Cemetery, and they've marked it, or I guess they're going to put a marker on it. And but they know the exact place now, and they've taken flowers there to the cemetery on Memorial Day. Now, for a couple of years, I thought I'd report that.
It's a good report. It is an interesting thing that our interest in and the love for our ancestors is directly proportional to the good that they did coming and bearing fruit in our lives. That's why we meet here, too. Thank you. Are you aware that each of the wives that I have mentioned here are recorded by this good artist right in there? Would you, after this meeting, as we eat lunch, would you be over there so that those people can learn a little bit more about them? Yes, please.
Say one more thing, or else I'll get in trouble. I spoke of Agatha Ann Lee, which was the first wife of John D. Lee. I'd like to speak about my great-grandmother, Mary Ann Williams.
Say your name once again.
Mary Ann Williams.
Mary Ann Williams. Okay.
Yes. Now, most of you probably don't know this. Mary Ann Williams was the 16th wife of John D. Lee, which is my great-grandmother. My great-great-grandmother was Agatha Ann Lee. Now, that's a little hard to explain to the Lee family, probably. But my great-grandfather, John Alma Lee, married Mary Ann Williams, which was John's seal to John D. Lee as a girl at 12 years old, approximately. As she decided that John D. Lee was more like a father than a husband, and of course that marriage never did complete in church. But John D. Lee said to her, if you have anyone else that you so desire in this life, I will do everything I can do to make you happy. And he married his oldest son, John Alma Lee, and Mary Ann Williams as husband and wife, his 16th wife.
Can we ask how many of you by hand raising remember that episode or that arrangement? Can you see? That's right. Do you see where that story is going?
Great story.
Very, very good. Thank you for your.
One other question I'd ask this group. We've been trying to find out where our great-grandmother and great-grandfather was buried. We think it's next to John Alma Lee's grave in Bainbridge. But there was a flood came through there a number of years ago and disturbed the headstones. And if anybody knows anything about that, we'd sure like to talk to you. That's all I have.
I'd just like to make one more comment. All of these histories are in the book that Mother wrote, that you all sent to her, so it's a very valuable book for you to read, but it is on the computer. I think you heard, did you hear me? I just said that all of these histories are in Mother's book. And you can, they are on the computer. I think your second book was put on the computer that I can't remember who wrote it, but it is available to you.
About the books, are they still available to be purchased?
Not the original. It's been out of print many years ago. Anybody wants to have a question, you can write to me in Provo, Utah, and I'll answer it when I can for the book.
Thank you very much. There was one that we need to ask for, and that was Lavina. Lavina, yeah, we missed her. Do we have descendants? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Boy, we would have missed you. Which one of these is the president pro tem right now? Sure, you're elected. Stand, take the microphone. Tell us about Lavina Young and then the traditions. Sure.
I'll say something.
Sure.
I'm not really
That's all right.
recently briefed on her history. I didn't think I was going to come here and promote her at all, but she had a sister named Polly. The two of them were very close. John D. Lee knew them. He converted the family.
Tennessee.
They're in Tennessee, and their last name was Young. I'm not sure if they were related to Brigham, but some way back there they could have been connected. I don't know. But anyway, then he married them in the Nauvoo Temple. They were wives number 7 and 8 or something like that of John D. Lee. But the two sisters were so close together that he married both of them, I believe, the same day. I don't know who he went on the first honeymoon with, but anyway, that's not important. But they came out west with him, and they settled here in Washington, Utah, and he built his mansion home in Washington, and he housed Polly and in Lavina. We're through Lavina.
In that home.
In that home.
Very.
That's the home that was torn down because they believed it was haunted and they had people, children buried in the backyard and so forth. But anyway, you can see it in Washington because Mayor Covington built the home patterned after John D. Lee's home, and it's on the opposite corner of the block. And many people that drive by there think that the Covington home is the John D. Lee home, which it isn't. But anyway, it's a beautiful home with a banister that goes all the way around the top of the second floor or story. And in the John D. Lee's home there, they had all of the town meetings, they had the dances, they had parties. That was the gathering place for the people in the city of Washington. But it's sad that the people in Washington don't want to recognize John D. Lee these days. Yes?
I just read an article, I live here, and it was talking about, I thought it was saying that Covington home was the first, or the oldest home in the city of Washington, and that it was owned by Covington, who was the first bishop, and this is where they had all the general authorities come, and I thought, that sounds just like the John D. Lee home. Okay, that's really interesting.
Yeah, it's confused with the John D. Lee home, and the authorities and the general authorities and Brigham Young came down would stay with John D. Lee in his home. But that is mixed up with, it's now the Covington home, but the Covington home was built after, and it was patterned after John D. Lee's home because it was such a magnificent structure. And, what's that? Oh, it's for sale today for $400,000. But way overpriced, but it's also a state historical site. It has several interesting signs around it. It's a beautiful home.
Yes, let me thank you, Lavanya, Wilcox.
I understand that all the stones in the bottom of where the little museum is over there,
Yes.
were out of the home of John D. Lee.
That's what I understand too, yes.
Tell him with the
Brother Wilcox,
statue.
do you have?
What's setting on where his statue?
Oh, his statue, you know, of the statue square in the city of Washington where we wanted to put his statue, there is a big pot of flowers there. It is the central main place where all the other statues are located in that square. He should be at the head, and he's not, and it breaks my heart that he's not. And there are several people in the city of Washington that are presently in favor of reinstating his statue in that place.
Could we say that
And I
that's,
think it should be. I personally think it should be stated or rested there in his rightful place in the city of Washington.
you would know that the presidency of this family has discussed that, and we'll leave that for the future.
Okay.
Now,
Well, his statue is in the city of not Leeds, but of Silver Reef, outside the Wells Fargo store. And if you want to see it, it's not anymore. Well, that's a recent event because it was there the last time we saw it.
He can tell you about his statue.
we have a comment from a lady right there who's sitting by Lenny.
No, that's his wife. She's trying to tell him what to say.
Never works, so.
Brother Wilcox.
I lived up the street from that Covington home for 25 years, not knowing that John D. Lee's home was on the opposite corner. And John D. Lee owned the whole block that I lived on, all but the Covington home. He actually owned that whole block. And I lived there for 25 years until after I moved, I didn't really realize that. And I have heard from some of the real old people there in Washington that they were told not to play on that lot because John D. Lee had very little children in the backyard.
We heard that, and so those urban legends are destructive. We pass them by.
The man that rebuilt the home, restored the Covington home, it was about to be destroyed. His name was Andy Earl, and I got to go help him do some of the work.
We're glad to hear
Really
that.
fun.
We're very glad to hear that. Now, there are a couple of announcements we need to make, and that is, yes, please, stand and take the microphone, please. You can stand where you are.
Thanks to this wonderful lady's mom, I'm grateful. Me and my husband were looking through the John D. Lee book that her mom made, and there's a man named Isaac Ransford Cole.
You need to cry a little bit, just take a minute or two.
He's my great-grandfather, and he's my grandmother's grandfather. Anyway, it was in this book, and we couldn't figure out why it would be in the John D. Lee book. So we were looking through it and trying to find things out, and apparently Grandpa Colby had 2 wives. I'm from the second wife, and he's from the first. And through that line there, Patience Groves, who's Mary Lee Groves' sister. So I feel like I'm part of the family indirectly. But I didn't know if anyone knew. But Patience, I learned a little bit about Patience and Mary Lee because of a wonderful lady that Larry introduced me to, who wrote a history on Patience. And she died here a few years back. But it brought Richard and I closer together because we had a common goal in this finding out about our grandfather.
We have just adopted you now. All right. Now it is time. Yes, please.
I'd like to say, are you finished?
I'm finished. If you want to speak, I'm finished.
I can't sit there and not say something about my wife. We are a double John D. Lee family. Who is your descendant or ancestor? Lavina Young. And we have my daughter, who is a double descendant through both Agatha, not Agatha, but Rachel. And my wife is from Lavina Young, so we got a double barrel there. So stand up, ladies, so everybody can see you. I got to tell this story. Oh, by the way, when we were at BYU, both Sharon and I, Sharon was in the dormitories there, and guess who were her dormitory parents were? Newell Kay and his wife, Ida May. And there's one other story I want to tell. Sharon had an aunt up in Salt Lake that she visited while she was at BYU. And when I started going with her, she went up to see her aunt and told her about this boy she was going with. And she said, he's a descendant of John D. Lee. And my wife and her aunt said, well, my dear, you too are a descendant of John D. Lee. She didn't know that. But I don't know whether that has any impairment on the genes, but I think I have a pretty good family. I have 3 girls and 3 boys, and they're all the best of the lot.
We anticipate hearing from Vern Lee later in this program, and you'll know that it will be very enjoyable. Housekeeping item. Every one of you here knows your address and email if you have one. You also know others who are descendants of John D. Lee, and their names and their addresses, current addresses. If you will make sure that they are on the record before you leave, then we can contact them and ask them for their email. It is so much easier nowadays to contact people from emails, and you have seen that, haven't you, on the Evite that came. We want to establish that. If a person has reached the age like I have and may not have an email, although we have an email, we will then use an email to enter your family with your permission and get word to you in the future on these events. We hope after this reunion to summarize these things you heard and put them on the Lee Quarterly, and then you will be able to get them on the internet. When the John D. Lee website. Yes, Lenny?
You forgot Emma Bachelor Lane.
We forgot Emma Bachelor. How did we do that? Thank you.
You actually, about 4 years ago, someone emailed me and asked me to take over the job as her president, which I did.
Oh, that is even more important.
Do you want to hear something about her?
Well, this is a good time. We know something about that good lady.
If I hadn't said something, she would never forgive me because she was one of the stalwart wives that stayed with him. She left Fort Harmony, for those of you who don't know, left Fort Harmony intending to live with Ann Gorge. And the story is that Ann Gorge actually fell into the cellar and could not get out because she was quite a heavy lady. And because all of the people on the wagon train going towards Lee's Ferry was laughing at her, she stayed behind. So Emma Bachelor took her children with her to Lee's Ferry. But to make a long story short, she was, I would call John D. Lee's strongest backbone at Lee's Ferry. She would be left alone by him many times. She delivered a baby by herself there. After she actually went to his trials and was a great defender of him. After he was executed, she went south into Arizona and married a guy named Frank French, who, doing the research, I think he wasn't too good of a provider, but she became known as Dr. French. And if any of you are interested, I have a True West magazine that I purchased at a low expense, but I have a copy of that if anyone would like to look at it. But she had actually in England attended some nursing schools, and so she had a background in nursing. And she was one of the few women, I think, to be really, really meticulously clean, and I think it was due to that background. But when she went into Arizona, of course, she was left to fend for herself, as many of the wives were, and she kind of took care of the hotel and stuff, and she bandaged up people that were in the saloons and the bars and kind of took care of them. And one story that I really liked was the one where the two men had shot each other, stabbed each other, done the utmost deeds that they could, and the doctor in the town wouldn't even look at them. She cared for them, nursed them back to health, and the story goes that later they finished the deed. But anyway, she settled in Winslow. Richard and I have gone down there and found her grave. You cannot read the headstone anymore. But he lives in New Mexico, and we've done a lot of jaunts and we've seen the young sisters' graves that are just north of Alpine and walked over into their cemetery and taking pictures of their headstones and everything. But Emma Bachelor died there in Winslow, and she's buried there, and I have said the town, her history, and they've never acknowledged it, which I didn't really expect a pat on the back, except I can't wait to meet her because she was very, very brave, and I like the term for spunky pioneer women, because they would have had her then.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Lee, don't anyone leave here, we'll come back to you in just a minute. Don't anyone leave here without information that is up to date, so that we can contact you and through you, those that you write on the data. And there we have a computer all set up, can be done that, can be accepting of that. Any questions on that one?
I have another comment about him.
No, yes, go ahead.
This is a newspaper article from Gallup, New Mexico.
What date?
About John D. D. Lee's gold.
What date?
It was March 23rd, 09.
09?
09. Yeah, just a recent article about a guy that wrote a letter about John D. Lee's gold. And it said in here that Emma Lee continued to live at Farm and Lee's Ferry for several years, but eventually moved to Holbrook, Arizona, where she married pioneer miner and rancher Franklin French. Relying on information supplied by Emma, French spent several years searching for the lost Lee mine with no apparent success. Now, he married her for that reason.
Well,
but it also says that John D. Lee had 19 wives, 2 of whom were Paiute.
If you were, if anyone in your family has ever had a story about a lost mine, let's not say it now, but if anyone is here that doesn't have that story, I feel sorry for you. Now, do you know what we're asking you to do relative to data? Now we're going to have that question with Carl.
I just have a quickie, maybe the last one or something.
That'll be fine.
Anyway, since I'm from Agatha Ann, and I have a little bit to do with the burial plot of that lady.
Thank you for what you've done.
I was not ordered, I was ordered, not requested, but ordered by my auntie to go down there and build a fence around that graveyard.
And you're the one that did it?
I'm the one that did that.
Would you
Me and my 3 sons. But I have a story here that goes on with that. They weren't too excited about going down there to do this. And I told them, I said, well, come on, I'll let you drive some of my old cars if you'll come and help me do it. So they decided that they would. We got our truck, a cement mixer, and we got all kinds of good materials that we needed, including the fence. And we hauled ourselves over to the gravesite. And well, by that time, we could come around the west side and come in with the truck. And we unloaded everything, laid it out, laid the plot out, got our 90-degree angles, and got them exactly straight where the fence is now. And we decided that that was where we were going to start, and we did. We dug all the post holes, put them in there and everything. About halfway through, my sons came to me and they said, Dad, we don't understand this 5 generations of fixing graves. And I said, sons, it is very, very simple. A little bit of his blood runs in your veins. They dug the holes like crazy and we finished the fence.
Would you do us a favor of not leaving before you tell just what you said to Mark Richardson, who is the computer whiz, and get this on the Lee Quarterly as it goes out this next time around, please?
I could if I knew who he was.
All right, you go in there and look at that computer. He's sitting there looking at it.
Oh, it was right
He was
here. I'm sorry. Okay, I know.
They've probably gone over and picked up the lunches, but they'll be back, and he would like that. He just did
Well, that was a jump from that fence up, but we're certainly glad we did it.
Very good. Now I'm going to ask you what I asked the others. If we look at you intently, do you know what message we're sending to you? Thank you for doing that.
Probably appreciate that.
Now it is time that we went in and had a break. Now we could have ordered it brought in for $18. We could have made it ourselves for about $8. We got someone to make a sandwich and some little things for $5. And guess what's what we took? But it's still worthy of asking a blessing upon the food. And the mother of Judge Lee, would you stand and take the microphone? Maybe you could come up here and just talk to Heavenly Father about anything you want to say, including the food. We'll say amen. Yeah. She can stand right there. We're going to listen carefully as you pray. Or if you want to say anything, you can say something before. It's up to you.
Well, I'd just like to say I have enjoyed all the comments that have been made today, and I'll give the prayer now. Heavenly Father, as we end this session and go into the refreshments, we ask you to bless the food, that it may nourish our bodies and bless us. We say this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.